Currently, Earth. It was May 4th in the year 1776 that Rhode Island, the colony founded by the most radical religious dissenters from the Puritans of Massachusetts Bay Colony, becomes the first North American colony to renounce its allegiance to King George III. Ironically, Rhode Island would be the last state to ratify the new American Constitution more than 14 years later on May 29th in 1790. Rhode Island served as a mercantile center of the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th century. West Indian molasses became rum in Rhode Island distilleries, which was then traded to the West African coast for enslaved workers. After taking their human cargo across the notorious Middle Passage from Africa across the Atlantic to the Caribbean islands, Rhode Island merchants would then sell those who survived the boat's wretched conditions and rough ocean crossing to West Indian plantation owners for use as enslaved workers in exchange for a fresh shipment of molasses. Desire to protect this lucrative triangle trade led Rhode Islanders to bristle at British attempts to tighten their control over their colony's commerce, beginning with the Sugar Act of 1764, which tightened trade regulations and raised the duty on molasses. Two major incidents involving Rhode Islanders took place during the ensuing colonial protest of British regulation in the late 1760s and the early 1770s. On June 10th in 1768, British customs officials confiscated John Hancock's sloop, Liberty, because it had previously been used to smuggle Madeira wine. This incited a riot on the streets of Boston. 4 years later, near Providence, the British customs boat Gaspee ran aground, and Rhode Islanders, angered by continued British attempts to tax them in ways they perceived as unfair, boarded and burned it, wounding the ship's captain. Rhode Island mercantile strength caused almost as much trouble for the new American nation as it had the old British Empire. Because it had independent wealth and trade coming through the two vibrant ports of Providence and Newport, Rhode Island was the only small state that could theoretically survive independent and proposed federal union in 1787. The state had no desire to lose income in the form of import duties to the new federal government. As a result, Rhode Island was the last state to ratify the Constitution in 1790. When it was finally confronted with the prospect of the greater financial impositions it would suffer being treated as a foreign country from the United States. It was May 4th in the year 1905 that a ceremony marks the official beginning of the second attempt to build the Panama Canal. The second attempt to bridge the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans will succeed, dramatically altering the world trade as well as the physical and geopolitical landscape of Central America. For decades before it was attempted, merchants and engineers fixated on the idea of creating a passage through Central America for ocean-going vessels, sparing them thousands of nautical miles and the dangerous trip around Cape Horn. A French company was the first to attempt building such a canal, but the results were disastrous. Roughly 20,000 workers continued their eternity due to accidents and tropical diseases, and the company collapsed without coming close to completing the canal. In 1902, our nation's Congress passed the Spooner Act, authorizing the acquisition of the defunct French company. After failing to reach a deal with Colombia to dig the canal, the U.S. backed separatists in the Isthmus of Panama, leading to the birth of a new nation as well as the Panama Canal Zone, a strip of land 10 miles wide along the route of the canal over which the U.S. would hold jurisdiction. On May 4th in 1905, dubbed Acquisition Day, the project became official. Our nation's construction people largely avoided the mistakes that had doomed the French project. Engineers used dams to create an inland lake connected to the oceans by locks, rather than building a sea-level canal all the way across the isthmus. In addition to creating the Gatun Lake, then the largest artificial lake in the world. The project also required the blasting of the Galliard Cut, also known as the Culebra Cut, an artificial gorge which was dynamited out of the rock of the Continental Divide so that the canal could flow through. In October of 1913, nearly 10 years after the construction had resumed, a telegram from President Woodrow Wilson, our nation's 28th president, triggered the detonation of a dike and the flooding of the Culebra Cut, joining the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific. The following August, the Panama Canal officially opened, immediately altering patterns of world trade in ways comparable only to the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. Accidents, disease, and the extremely hot condition continued the eternity of 5,609 workers over the decade it took to complete the canal. Our nation remained the de facto sovereign of the canal and the canal zone until 1979, when U.S. President Jimmy Carter, our nation's 39th president, and the U.S. agreed to transfer management of the canal to Panama on December 31st in 1999. It was May 4th in the year 1970 in Kent, Ohio, that 28 National Guardsmen fired their weapons at a group of anti-war demonstrators on the Kent State University campus, continuing the eternity of 4 students, wounding 8, and permanently paralyzing another. The tragedy was a watershed moment for a nation divided by the conflict in Vietnam and further galvanized the anti-war movement. 2 days earlier, on May 2nd, National Guard troops were called to Kent to suppress students rioting in protest of the Vietnam War and the U.S. invasion of Cambodia. The next day, scattered protests were dispersed by tear gas, and on May 4th, class resumed at the Kent State University. By noon that day, despite a ban on rallies, some 2,000 people had assembled on the campus. National Guard troops arrived and ordered the crowd to disperse, fired tear gas in advance against the students with bayonets fixed on their rifles. Some of the protesters, refusing to yield, responded by throwing rocks and verbally taunting the troops. Minutes later, without firing a warning shot, the guardsmen discharged more than 60 rounds towards a group of demonstrators in a nearby parking lot, continuing the eternity of 4 and wounding 9. The closest casualty was 20 yards away, and the farthest was almost 250 yards away. After a period of disbelief, shock, and attempts at first aid, angry students gathered on a nearby slope and were again ordered to move by the guardsmen. Faculty members were able to convince the group to disperse, and further bloodshed was prevented. The shootings led to protests on college campuses across the nation. Photographs of the massacre became enduring images of the anti-war movement. In 1974, at the end of a criminal investigation, a federal court dropped all charges levied against 8 Ohio National Guardsmen for their role in the Kent State students' continuances of eternity. The historic information divulged on this audio file can be verified on History.com.